cut into our guest presenters time.
Well, by all means, then, let me welcome everybody. I'm Ed Lebo. I'm Director of the Public Art Program here at the Phoenix Office of Arts and Culture, and we're delighted you could join us. And I'd like to sort of share introductions with our staff here who've helped to move these projects along and manage all the projects that we've done over the years. Barry, why don't I have you introduce yourself?
I'm Barry Sparkman. I'm one of the public art project managers, and I will be the manager for this project that we're going to talk about today.
Katie Bayaris?
Hi, I'm Katie Bayaris. I'm also a project manager in the Office of Arts and Culture.
Thank you, Katie. Also, just a word which will bolster later on is that Katie and Barry and the whole team has been involved over the last year in developing a number of workshops that are recorded and also posted online at our website, phoenix.gov/arts, and find your way to the workshops page, and we'll show you that later on. But they're really resourceful. They're great resources for artists and also community members interested in how the arts and public art in particular works here in Phoenix. So with that, why don't we start in with the presentation, Barry. This is sort of a pre-submittal meeting workshop for a call that we have out now. Here comes the pictures. It's part of our Sunblock project, and this is a project that is funded in part by the National Endowment for the Arts, and it has several components. One is the development of a heat booklet, which we're sort of finalizing right now, which lays out the problem we face or the challenges we face as a city, a highly urbanized place, and the rising temperatures that we see, not only in the summer, but also throughout the year. The second piece to this is part of this project here, which is selecting artists to design shade screens for standard city bus shelters. And as I mentioned, and Barry will go into that in more detail in a little bit, but as I mentioned, we have some serious challenges here in Phoenix. As you can see from this, we have some high temperatures. We can go on to the next. And over the last, between 1952 and 2013, the average low summer temperature, that is the temperature below which the thermometer does not drop at night, has risen 10 degrees, and that is a dramatic change. And some of that has to do with what you'll see in this next slide, is that Phoenix used to be, and you'll just have to forgive our delays here. It's just technology. We're going to blame it on technology from here on out. But Phoenix streetscapes used to look like this. They were lined with trees, ditches, and soft surfaces, all things that sort of help to cool a city after dark or cool where we live. Well, obviously, over the last century, that streetscape has changed. And as you'll see in the next slide, the change in some areas has been quite dramatic. This was just happened to be an August day in 2019 before the pandemic and all of that, but took a walk on an area of the city where artists are going to have a chance to improve some of the bus shelters or enhance them. This is 9th Street and Buckeye. And as you can see here, it has a lot of hard surfaces and also some surprising facts about dirt surfaces. And we can see those in the next slide. So asphalt, 165 degrees. Dirt, 160 degrees. Gravel, 154 degrees. Concrete, 142 degrees. And one of the reasons that we have focused on bus shelters is that we know that many people who rely on mass transit aren't delivered to those bus shelters by cars, but they have to walk from their homes to those shelters. And so what is the path, the cooling path that enables them to stay safe during that passage? The one thing I did not mention, and I'll mention it now because it is a striking figure, is that last year in this state, more than 500 people died because of heat-related illnesses, and many more wound up in hospitals. And so this whole sunblock effort that we're undertaking with ASU, with National Endowment for the Arts, and also our partners at heat specialists and climate specialists at Arizona State University, is to try to address this in some small ways, at least create some prototypes that might be helpful to this situation. And if you see in the next slide that by moderating and adding shade to areas, this is something that can bring these temperatures down dramatically. Inside the bus shelter you see there on that similar day, it was 95 degrees. Small shade trees can bring it to 99 out in exposed areas, or bushes can bring it to 100 degrees. So you can see there's potentially anywhere from a 45 to a 65 degree difference in temperature simply by bringing more shade. And I think many of you may know that this is not anything new. This effort is not new for the public art program. In the next series of slides, I just want to whet your appetite with what artists have been able to achieve through the public art program and in combination with landscape architects and other design professionals. You go on Pierce Street, just off of Central Avenue. There's the Bloom canopy that was designed by Matter Practice and Gavin and Barker landscape architects. And this was an effort to really look at a city street, narrow it from 65, that is the travel lane, from 65 to 25, so that we could expand sidewalks, line both sides of the street with shade, and then also bring in these artist designed shade structures. And I just sort of show you these. This is not going to be possible in this project that we're going to share with you today, but this is sort of some of the ways that artists have helped us to reimagine our city streetscapes. And let me show you a few more of those pictures, if you would move on, Barry. Little Canyon Trail, which is 31st Avenue extended north of Camelback up to Missouri. Artist Lori Lundquist and the Sherman Group, landscape architects, developed a tree-lined corridor that is off-street, but it connects a key portion of the city's bike trail network. And so this is something that public art can do, and artists working with landscape architects in the community have done as part of the public art program. And we'll look at a few more examples before we get into the specifics of this project. Yang-Chi Lee created these beautiful shade structures at Reach 11 up north in North Phoenix at the vast soccer complex that's there. And they were beautifully used by all of the sisters and brothers and families of people who go there to watch the soccer matches. We can go on to the next one. I think many of you who are in the downtown area are familiar with Mi-Jin Yoon's and Janet Weibel's the shadow play area on Roosevelt Street. It's lighted at night, but shaded during the day with benches. Next, we'll go on to the next, Barry. And then Mary Lucking, who will be sharing the stage with us today, has done these and many other beautiful shade structures as part of bus shelters throughout the city. We'll go on to the next. So in the area of standard city bus shelters, this is also not something new to the public art program. Artists here have been working with this program to develop some really beautiful shade structures as part of standard city bus shelters. And one of the things that's pretty interesting is there has been some research done, thanks to our climate research team at ASU, that if you beautify an area, obviously shade helps, but if you also beautify that shade, the experience of sitting and waiting becomes much more pleasurable, needless to say, and also I think improves the quality of life for people who would use these shade structures. So ultimately that is the goal of this project, to continue to improve the quality of the experience of people who ride city transit, rely on shade structures to cool themselves. We'll move on to the next. Here are a couple more examples of the ways artists have designed city bus shelters. John Reynolds on the left, Leticia Huerta on the right. In the case of the Isaac Streetscape, Leticia's project, it really modified the standard footprint of the shelter. And you can see there's mosaics there as well. On to the next. And these are Leticia Huerta's 67th Avenue standard city bus shelters, but the designs that she incorporated into those shade structures. And you can see just how beautiful the line work is. And this is something that we're looking for, and Barry will talk more about, from the artist pool that comes in for this project. There's great opportunity to do some magnificent two-dimensional work on solid and durable materials, and we'll go on to the next. And those materials are not only beautiful as surfaces, but also create wonderful shade patterns that become part of the streetscape and the ambiance. And so I show you these just to sort of whet your appetites about what is possible with standard city bus shelters. And then I'd like to turn it back over to Barry Sparkman to talk specifically about this project, the scope of its work, and how you might get involved in that. So take it away, Barry.
Sure. So this project is to commission up to 6 artists to design custom shade screens that the designs will be cut in metal, and they'll be installed in standard City of Phoenix bus shelters. We're still working with the transit department and the fabricator to figure out how many of these shelters we can actually build and the locations where they'll be installed. So we can't share those details with you today. So as Ed said, I'm just going to give you a really quick overview of what's required to submit for this project. I'm going to rush through this because I don't want to take away time from Mary's presentation. If you have questions as I'm talking, you could type those into the chat and we'll make sure that they all get answered. So the bus shelters that we'll be using will look something like this. These are shelters that were designed by ASU industrial design students. This is a prototype for those. There's a few variations of this design. Some of them are a bit larger, and there's also some furniture that goes with them, seating. And which of the shelter designs is used will be determined by the specifics of the location. If there's more room, obviously, we'll use a larger shelter. But some of the bus shelter locations are really small around the city. And these industrial design students were designing these with the goal of improving on existing bus shelter designs so that there's shade at all times of the day. I don't know how many of you take buses and if you've been at shelters before, but often the shade is not really where it's supposed to be. It's beside the shelter itself. And unlike some of the really beautiful large projects that Ed showed before, where the artists have more of an impact on the shelter itself, those projects take a larger design team and artists working with engineers and all kinds of folks like that, design professionals. But these bus shelters have already been engineered. So all we're asking artists to do is design the perforations that will be cut into the metal. And I'll mention that it doesn't matter how you as an artist arrive, if you're selected, how you arrive at the design. Some artists are really comfortable working digitally in Photoshop or Illustrator or even CAD. Other artists prefer to do it the old-fashioned way in the studio with paint or by drawing. If you're rendering the designs by hand, then those ultimately will have to be converted to digital files that the fabricator will use to cut the metal. And if you don't have experience doing that, we've had some workshops about just that topic. And I think Katie may be posting some links in the chat where you can go to those resources to see how you could do that yourself. Other artists don't want to be involved with this process at all, so they just pay a designer to create the files that are needed for fabrication. But not to worry about this at this point. Your project manager, will likely be me, will be working through this whole process with the artist. And I think Mary may say a little bit more about that later in the presentation today. So the responsibility of the artists that are selected will be to design the perforations that are in the steel. You've seen beautiful examples of that in the earlier slides. You'll be selecting the color for the powder coating for the shelter. The engineering, like I said, is already done. The shelters will be bolted into 4-inch thick pads, and we hope to be able to add some trees at some of the locations to provide additional shade. We try to make the submission process, it's really easy. It's important, I'll say this multiple times, it's really important that you read all of the instructions before you submit for the project. All that you need to collect before you begin the submission process is a very brief statement of intent. That's just like maybe a cover letter, you could think of it, or a job application where you're just saying why you're interested in this specific project. You can highlight if you have any relevant experience. And I'll show you momentarily, it's a box where you paste the content into Café, which we'll get into, and there's the character limit won't let you add more than 1,000 characters. So that's has to be just a very brief statement. You'll need a standard resume with a 3-page limit. If you're submitting for the project as a team, we'll need resumes for all of the team members. We'll need an image list, which is just a list that includes basic information about the images that you're submitting, the titles, the years they were completed, the media, just the standard things. And if some of the images that you're submitting were created by a team, you'll need to explain what your role was in creating the artwork. And then finally, you'll need up to 6 JPEGs of past completed work. And there's an opportunity when you're submitting the images for you to also include some captions that will be seen by the selection panelists along with those. And then this next part is very important. It's in the instructions that you'll be reading. When the selection panelists review the submissions initially, they'll be doing it online, and it's done, we call it a blind jury. It's completely anonymous. So it's really important in your statement of intent, in your image list, and in your images and the captions that accompany those. It's really important that you not include any identifying information, no names, no URLs to websites or YouTube channels. We love to make selfies with our artwork, but this submission is not the place for those. You should include your name on the resume. The panelists don't have access to those online initially. We share that content with them later in the process. Submissions will be accepted through callforentry.org, or Café for short. If you don't already have an account for that, it's really easy to set one up, and it's free. Here's the URL for Café. And below that is the URL for our specific call, the one that we're discussing today. If you just land at the homepage for Call for Entry, you can search with keywords to find the call. Search with things like Phoenix or bus shelter, and you'll end up there. And there's a video instruction, a link to video instructions of specifically how to submit in Café that Katie made for us. So there's a URL for that also. And in the next image, I'm going to show you the terms and conditions that you need to read thoroughly before you submit. And in Café on the website, there's a whole lot of dense text that's in a small box that you have to scroll through. If it's easier for you, lots of artists like to download that information from our website, and the link for that is here. You can download a PDF version of all this, and it's a little bit easier to get through, and then you have it there readily when you get to the Café process. After you've set up your Café account and you've uploaded the images that you want to submit, you log in and select the call, and you end up at a page that looks like this. This is what I was just saying. All of the information that in here that's in this box that you have to scroll through is all of the really important stuff, like the scope of work, the budget, the project timeline, all of the instructions that we're going over now, and then information about the selection process, and also some insurance requirements that the artists that are selected for this project will have to get. So I know it's really tempting. We are bombarded with pop-ups all the time that want us to agree to cookies and all kinds of things. So it's really tempting just to look at this and scroll quickly and hit agree. But I really, really encourage you to read through the whole thing so you know all of what you should expect. After you agree to the terms and conditions, you get to the submission form, which is really pretty straightforward and really simple. Here's the area where you paste your 1,000-character artist statement that I described earlier. There's links to upload the image list. Those can be PDFs or Word documents, and the same goes for the resumes. After you get those things completed, then you have to choose the work samples that you've already uploaded when you were setting up your account. And what you can't see in this screenshot is that all of the images in your portfolio there'll be thumbnails of all of them down there. And you just have to pick the 6 that you want to use, and you can select the order that the jurors will see them. The estimated budget for these projects will be $10,000 for each design. And you see the timeline below that. Here we are at the pre-submittal meeting today. The deadline for submissions is August 26th. Notice that it's at 10:59. Artists tend to be last minute, and a cafe or call for entry is based in Denver. So it's midnight Denver time. And then we hope to have the selection panel in September and get artist contracts started that same month. And because this is a City of Phoenix procurement process, if you have questions that come up as you're submitting after today's session, they need to be sent to our procurement officer, Romeo Ragusa, and there's his contact information. Are there anything you want to add, Katie, before I turn it back over to Ed?
No, I just wanted to point out I put a couple of links into our chat box there. The first one is a link to the workshops on using software that are available on the Office of Arts and Culture's YouTube page that's helpful, that Barry referenced. The second link is the direct link to the call to artists, which is in Cafe. And then the third link is to our website opportunities page, where you can find more information. Like you can find Romeo's contact information there. It's probably how you found the link to this particular workshop, so you've probably been there already. So there are a couple of helpful links. And then here's another one as well. This is a link to a YouTube page for the International Sculpture Center. We recently completed a couple of portfolio review sessions with the International Sculpture Center that could maybe provide you with some tips as you complete your application, because we go through with, they have 3 posted up here. Eventually there will be 4. We go through the process with 12 different artists of reviewing their portfolio images and their statements and offering them suggestions. If you watch those, you may be able to glean some information from the advice that we provided to those artists as well during their portfolio reviews. Like maybe look for the artists that might have work that's sort of comparable to yours, and listen to the advice before you apply to the call.
Thanks, Katie. That's a really good point that I neglected. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Ed, to introduce Mary.
Thank you, and thank you for bearing with us on all these details. They're really important, as Barry pointed out, and it's important for you to look at those and make sure that your submittal is compliant with those. It makes for a fair process. And I can't stress enough the anonymity piece as we've worked over the years to try and level the playing field so that all artists, when they compete and show their work before a panel, are doing so on an equal basis. And with that, it really is great pleasure that I have the chance to introduce Mary Lucking. Mary has done a number of projects for the city of Phoenix, but also many throughout the country. She creates artworks that help people explore and I think understand their environments and communities. And her work ranges from large-scale permanent works to temporary interactive installations, and they include art incorporated into walking or bicycle trails, transit stations, college campuses, neighborhood parks. Her artwork has been in the permanent public art collections of cities beyond Phoenix, nationwide, and it's been shown at the MCA, Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, Boston Cyber Arts Festival, SIGGRAPH, the Cheekwood Museum of Art, University of Michigan, Arizona State University, CUNY Graduate School, Vanderbilt, Phoenix Art Museum, and I would imagine many more. 3 of her projects have received Americans for the Arts Public Art Network Award for Year in Review, which is really quite a thing. She holds a bachelor's degree in architecture from Wellesley College and a Master of Fine Arts in Art and Technology from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And she's an artist right here in Phoenix. I'm delighted to turn the floor over to you, Mary. She has great insights about these kinds of projects, and I think her thoughts may be able to help all of us. Thanks so much for joining us, Mary.
Thanks, Ed. I really enjoy talking about public art anytime I can, so it's fun to be able to see all of you and share it. I just like to talk through some of the things I think about whenever I'm designing a bus shelter or shade structures. There's some things about this process that, as any artist, you're pretty familiar with, like how to make a beautiful image. But there's some things that are kind of specific to the shade structure and public art that if you have the right attitude, kind of make for interesting puzzles to solve. So I thought I'd go through some of those and show you what I think about whenever I'm designing shade structures. So the first thing is views, and Ed mentioned this when he was showing pictures of the other bus shelters. I'm always thinking about, especially with bus shelters, how these things are being perceived. And with bus shelters, I'm thinking specifically of 2 things. One is the person who's driving past them at 45 miles an hour, and the other is the person sitting at the bus shelter. And I think both are equally important. The first is kind of, we're building architecture for the city. We're putting these things out into the world, and we want them to be seen and understood by people moving quite fast. And that means making kind of really big, bold gestures. When you're thinking about drawing, it's the difference between a subtle pencil sketch and somebody using a big sumi ink brush. Wow. And so with these images, you're seeing something that can be glanced at and understood very, very quickly. But I'm also interested in creating something that's interesting and beautiful for the people who are standing at the station. So within those, the nice thing about the process of how these are made is either laser jet cut or water jet cut can make really, really intricate little sort of detail-y things. So you can do a lot of detail stuff too in your drawings that are the things that can be appreciated by the people who were sitting at the bus shelter, who might be here every day of their lives for years. So for instance, there are little daffodils in here that probably aren't seen by the cars, but can be seen by the people using the station. This is kind of basic 2D design ideas, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about when you're working with a piece of metal. And that's kind of positive and negative shapes. So when you're thinking about cutting out a metal panel, kind of the first and most obvious thing to do would be to cut a series of holes and make the holes the design. And in this case, that's what's happening here. And that's a really good thing to do in 2 cases. One, it tends to create a lot of metal, a lot of shade. But the other thing is it creates a very strong web of things. But it has a particular look. It looks like holes cut in metal. And I just like to put in your mind that there's another way of thinking about design, which is to think about the metal about the metal as the positive thing that you're drawing. So in this case, these are little houses, and those are the positive pieces, those are the metal pieces, and the cutouts are the things that are in the background. And so thinking about how your design can work in both of those ways, you can also combine them. So in this case, the shelter, if you look at the B in the upper corner here, this is a positive, the lines create, the metal lines create the B, but then in other areas, I'm cutting out areas to create the sky and the grass down here. And then there's some sort of practical things. One is shade versus openness, and this is a really tricky thing. You know, the more of a dark, more solid metal you put in, the more shade you create, but it's also, you lose the potential for some design differences. So in this case, what I did was I created down on the kind of the lower half where you're creating seating or shade for the seating. I used, there's more black here, there's more metal, but up higher, there's more open space. So using those denser areas and lighter areas can also create a more interesting image to look at. And but it's something to think about. Think about the person sitting on the thing, how much shade they're getting, and how much metal you want to be using. And then there's some safety issues. The most favorite of which is called the baby head rule, which is, it has to do with how big of an opening you can have safely. And the baby head rule comes from the fact that if you have an opening of a certain size, more than 4 inches, you have the potential for a small child to get their head stuck. And this is something we wanted to avoid. So when you look at these panels, you'll notice that they're all kind of broken up into smaller areas, and that's because of the baby head rule. And the way I check for this is when I'm designing, I always have a 4-inch circle that I'm kind of moving around my screen to make sure that there aren't any open holes. So if you see here, this is a blow up of it. You can see that it's actually a 3.75 circle, just to make sure that we're under it. But this area and this area are blocked so that a 4-inch baby head could not fit through this area. And then on the other side of the things, there are finger traps. And that if you imagine yourself hanging out at a bus shelter and you have a screen behind you and you're just kind of, your mind is wandering and you kind of stick your fingers through something, you really don't want a situation where your finger gets stuck. So there's a general sense, or a general set of rules for circles. You don't want to go smaller than 1.5 inches. And when I first heard about this one, I was like, oh no, that wouldn't happen. I did some web searches, and I'm not sharing this with you because you really don't want to see them, but it has happened. People have gotten their hands stuck in these circles. So staying kind of, any circle should be either above 1.5 inches or below 4 inches. And these are things that your project managers will certainly remind you of as you're creating the designs, but it's something to keep in the back of your mind. The nice thing about this, the finger traps, is that it only happens with pretty much perfect circles. So I had a design where I had a bunch of circles, and then I realized that I was creating a problem for myself. So I just made them not full circles. You know, if you take a bite out of a circle, it's no longer a finger trap. So the nice thing about a lot of these is that there are a set of engineering rules that you can kind of tweak to figure out how to make your design work within the constraints. Pointy stuff and skinny things. Again, this is a safety issue. This is a design for a bunch of screens I was doing up in Seattle. And the idea was to create pieces that looked like kind of pine needles flowing around in the wind. And I really liked the design. It was kind of looked like this, but I realized that I had created a bunch of really pointy things that can hurt people, and pointy things that can be bent out of shape. If you imagine somebody grabbing that piece and pulling it, that's kind of an issue. So you just want to make sure that you round over corners. And in this case, the way I figured out what to do with it was to kind of reverse positive and negative. So the needles, which were the black parts, the parts that were metal, became the holes, and the black parts became this outline around the metal. So there's always an engineering way to figure out your way out of one of these problems, but it's I'm kind of giving you all the constraints to think of, because I feel like the more you know the constraints that you're working with from the beginning, the easier it is to plan something that's going to work. And that's the final one. Oh boy. Climbability. I don't know if this is an issue. Barry would be able to tell you. On some of the projects, I've been preventing people from making it easy for them to climb up something has been an issue. So for this piece, which was for a Valley Metro station, they didn't want people getting up to power lines. Down here, this thing's 22 feet high. So they decided that above or below 6 feet, they wanted skinny little pieces that were vertical that would make it difficult for people to put their feet in. So that could be an issue with the bus shelters or not, but it's another thing to keep in mind. And then breaking up solid areas. This is less of a maintenance issue or a safety issue, or it's less of a safety issue and more of a maintenance issue. And so for this, this design, which we saw earlier, that's 22 feet high, there were these big black pants, which work well in terms of visuals, a big bold area, but it also creates a canvas for people to tag. So I always try to break up these images as much as possible, these big black areas, so that it reduces areas that are kind of screaming out to be filled in with text. And so the way I figured it this way was I kind of put some highlights in the pants and I put a picture of my dog in front of it. And you'll see the difference in the book too. I changed the book title to something that just broke up that area. Structure. This is the one that's hardest to put into words specifically, but it's or a set of actual rules, but it's just an interesting set of challenges. It's how to connect things. These are all pieces of metal, and I had to figure out a way of creating this face that would not be floating in midair, since all this blue stuff is just space. So it was figuring out how to attach the face to the eyes, and that's a creative challenge often. The way I often think about these is Pablo Picasso, these are tissue papers. I imagine my design as if it were cut out of tissue paper and imagine how it would hold. And if things are drooping or flopping one way or the other, I think to myself, that's something that needs to be connected in a different way. And I thought I'd show you just a few images of how I work. Barry mentioned working with a computer and having images transferred onto the computer. I tend to work with Adobe Illustrator for super graphic images like this, where we have lots of perfect circles. A computer is obviously much faster and better at that than a human being is. But also with images that are more hand-drawn, I find it handy to work with a computer. Here I started out with a photograph of my friend Elise, and I could tweak the images in the computer to make the daughter's arm hang out right and the book at the right size. And it allowed me to kind of trace that image and turn it into this. The computer also allows me to do lots of variations. So when I was trying to figure out what to do with Elise's pants, I could do many, many, many variations, look at them all at the same time, a lot faster than I would be able to work on paper. And again, the final version. That being said, there's no need to work from paper to begin with. You could work from cut paper. I'd also like to mention, just for inspiration, when I'm thinking about how other people have worked with cut metal, there are all these traditions of cut paper from all over the world. And one of my favorite is Japanese stencil making. There are a bunch of books. This is one of them, which is a way of looking at how different people have used positive and negative spaces in something that had to hold together into a unified thing. And then also, you can just use paper and pencil. This was a Sharpie marker. This is something I just scribbled the other day. And I took this into Adobe Illustrator, and there's a trace command that took that and immediately turned it into that. This will have to be cleaned up. If you look at this, there's some little jaggy edges here. So it's not no work, but I just want to emphasize that it is not an infinitely difficult thing to transfer your art from some sort of manual material into the computer. So I would say whatever you're used to using that best expresses your particular visual style, use that. As long as it's big and bold and graphic and black and white, we can figure out a way to transfer it into the computer. So just basic things I'm thinking about. Overall design, how your thing looks both close up and far away, the positive, negative elements, and how much shade you're creating for the person at the bus shelter. Hole size is a really important thing to keep in mind, either smaller than 4 inches and bigger than 1.5 inches. And breaking up big panels to discourage tagging. And then the most important thing is just think about your piece as a big web, as that pop-up avocado, and make sure that you're making something that's all going to hold together as one unified thing. And yeah, good luck. I think this is a really fun and exciting project for people to give you an intro to public art.
Mary, thanks so much for sharing your practice with us. It's always great to see these works. I know that we mentioned earlier, if you have questions, just plop them into the chat box there, and we'll turn to that in a second. Just one additional thought. Mary mentioned sort of the importance of breaking up large, flat surfaces. And you know, when you're dealing with metal or powder-coated metal, as is the case with bus shelters, the other thing that we've discovered is that if you create patterns of holes or openings, what that does is it provides a way for air to flow through the surface. And that air flowing through the surface is enormously helpful in cooling a place. And we have, we've done a number of studies, heat studies, that shows that when you have a solid surface versus a perforated one, air flows and cools, as Venturi would have it. So that's an important part to this. Barry, I'll turn it back over to you, and if there are questions, we can go at those one by one.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was really helpful. And one thing I failed to mention is that for the artists that are selected, our office will be working with the transit department to come up with a very specific set of guidelines that artists will be given before they're set off to create their designs. And it'll include all the kinds of things that Mary is talking about now, and including the climbability point that you made. I think with the bus shelters, that's not such an issue because they're relatively short, but that's all those things are still TBD until we have discussions with the other departments. And we do have a few questions. Thank you, Kelly, for your questions and kind words. The first question is the powder coating one color per shelter? And the answer is yes. Typically, the shelters are all one solid color, and that has to do not only with the budget, but also with maintaining things. We see all the time bus shelters getting hit by cars and having to be repaired or replaced. And if they're multicolored, that makes that process really complicated. The next question is also from Kelly. What's the minimum width you typically make a metal piece? 1/4 inch? Kelly, do you want to unmute yourself and kind of clarify what you're asking?
I think I understand.
Okay.
I think it's a depends answer. So this is how thin of a piece in your design can it be, and it really depends on the thickness of the metal. So if you have a really beefy stout thing, you can make it thinner, and if it's a really flimsy piece of metal, it can be thicker. So I tend to be on the conservative side. I'd say, and it also depends on how long it is. So if it's a foot-long piece that's 1/2 inch, that's an issue where if 2 circles are coming together, they might be able to be far less than that and be safe. So I'm going to say that probably when you get the guidelines, they'll tell you 1/2 inch is very safe under most circumstances. But again, it kind of depends on that whole web and how it's holding together.
The other thing that I can add to that, Mary and all, is that when we get to the design and fabrication phase, we'll have a fabricator on board who will be looking at that drawing that you've done or your design, and they will weigh in on whether it's structurally viable or not, or whether there are modifications that would need to be made to make it so. So that will all be part of the process for the artists who are selected to carry out designs and get stuff built.
And moving on, there's a question about what is the cost of the artist's required insurance and about the specifics of the insurance requirements. I don't really know specifically what the insurance costs, but it is affordable. There's an automobile insurance component to this that most artists can just add on to their existing policies. And then there's the liability insurance that's required. That's a new requirement, but you only have to have it for the time that you're working on the project. So it's not such a big commitment that it makes this unaffordable. Do you have anything to add to that, Ed?
I do not. I would encourage everyone to read the instructions for applying. A number of these questions are really answered in the application material. So look at that, but the insurance requirements and costs have never been onerous for professional artists to absorb as part of their practice. Katie, any other thoughts?
It's so different depending on your insurance provider that it's difficult for us to be able to estimate, other than saying we've never had an artist have a problem with it before. The best way to do it is to contact your insurance provider, send them the language that you see described here, and say, am I covered, or would I need to purchase additional, and how much would that be? That's what I would recommend.
And some of our artists also use insurance brokers. So there are insurance agents out there who deal with multiple companies, so they can shop around for the best bargain. And then there's questions about the submissions. We've been talking all about design, and I think may have confused some people. For the submission process, the jurors just will be looking at past completed work. So you don't need to make any design unless you're selected as one of the artists for the project. So then there's another question, is one submission limited to only one design for one shelter, or could one submission contain multiple possibilities or family of designs? And I think if I understand the question correctly, you're talking about if you're selected to create a design for one of the shelters. And then in that case, there will be a design process that you'll go through. So in the beginning, you certainly could make multiple designs, but as we work with the transit department and looking at all the things that the guidelines in the proposal, we'll narrow it down to one design per shelter. And you can let me know if I didn't answer that question fully.
One thing that I would stress to all is that some of these questions seem to are on the basis that people are expected to provide or submit designs. That's not the case. As we've said a couple times, it's based on past work. And look, I would say read the application materials closely, because all that we're asking artists to do is submit images of accomplished and past work. Sometimes artists like to send in proposals for what they would do if they got the job, and their models or their drawings. And I would discourage you from doing that, only because the panel will be looking just at past work and not anything you may be proposing just yet.
Yes, and if you did submit a proposal, you're kind of telling the panel what your design would be, and the panelists are looking for potential in your past work. So I would encourage you just to use the past work that you completed rather than the proposals. And the next question relates to that. Do you prefer looking at black and white designs in our submissions, or is our full color work okay? Your regular studio work is perfect just the way it is, whether it's color or black and white, but you don't need to modify it for this submission.
On that point, Barry, you know, we've stressed, and if you look at the Public Art 101 workshops that are up online, we've stressed over the years the importance of having excellent visuals, because you're all competing with people who hire professional photographers from time to time to get the best quality image of their work. And can't stress that enough. It's really important for you to represent yourself with the best quality photography that you can.
Are there more questions? That's all I see in the chat box.
Ed just referenced the Public Art 101 workshop. I just popped a link to that online workshop in the chat box as well. That actually takes you step by step through how to read an RFQ, how to think about selecting your images, and even has some like do's and don'ts on like use this type of image or don't use this type of image. That might help you as you're preparing to show us your past work in your applications. And I, again, would encourage you to look at those International Sculpture Center portfolio reviews because they go really in depth into how to consider what a panel is going to be thinking about when they are reviewing your potential. The panels are really looking to see your past work, to understand your thought process and how you have the potential to think about this project going forward. Like Ed was saying, it's not a place to submit a design just yet because you don't have all the information just yet. So we want to know your past work at this point. And so we can see how you think and how you process issues. And then one other tip that was really good from those reviews was think about who will be in the room. If you look at our selection panel process, the way that it works, we always have a community member on our selection panel. We always have city staff from the city departments. And there was one piece of advice to the artist that said, think about saying something for everyone in the room. You want to say something to that community person. You want to say something to that city staff person. You want to say something to the arts professional. There's always going to be arts professionals. They may be other administrators of public art programs. They may be artists like Mary. It kind of depends. So you want to make sure you're speaking to the aesthetics of the work and the art person in the room, the community person in the room, and the city person in the room who's going to be concerned with technical things. So,
Thanks, Katie. Any other questions? One thing I'd like to clarify is that we city staff, Barry, Katie, and I here, do not serve on these panels. We simply organize them and make sure they're fair. So we wish you all the best. Go to the application materials online, and if you have follow-up questions, by all means, be in touch with Romeo Rabusa. His name is listed on the application or the RFQ, request for qualifications. Mary, can't thank you enough for helping us out today and sharing your insights about this whole process. And all of you, thanks for spending an hour with us. We look forward to seeing your applications. Keep cool.
Thanks.
Thank you.